I'm just thinking about thinking and what that word means and what its limits are, really, I suppose. Trying to get underneath the word myself, see if I can understand it a bit better. Because I always say thinking is the processes that constitute the mind, but it may also constitute things that are not the mind. But I think certainly the mind is made of these processes called thinking. I'd also say thinking either takes place largely within or is initiated largely by the brain. Don't think there's much doubt about that. But once I get that beyond that point, I find it hard to draw clear boundaries on what's thinking and what's not, because certainly some people seem to refer to any cognitive process at all as thinking, whereas others, probably those of a more Cartesian bent, would say that only conscious thought is thinking. So it's a much narrower band of cognitive operations. Other people distinguish between thinking and feeling. So thinking starts to approximate something much more like calculation or computation, whereas anything that's got an emotional current to it or a felt sense to it is perhaps not thinking. I would disagree with that one. Perhaps I'll flesh my disagreement with that out in a minute. And where the boundaries are set are difficult. I mean, if you're, it seems to me that if you're setting a very high limit, or a very narrow limit for thinking, whether it's, for example, the consciousness thing, I mean, that seems highly restrictive. Because lots of our conscious thoughts, the conscious thoughts that I'm having right now, including the ones that are emerging as words out of my mouth, I mean, they start their life in the darkness, don't they, I have no idea the words that are comprising the end of this sentence or the next sentence I'm going to say until I get there. They're all being formulated elsewhere, outside of consciousness. But they're undoubtedly thinking, in probably the most rigorous definition. These sentences are following grammatical rules. They're referring to a relatively consistent set of ideas that I'm holding my attention on for a few moments. So anything that, as I say, even the most Cartesian person who's most wedded to the idea of the kind of transparent mind, and that's the place where thinking happens, I think would have to say that this is thinking. But as I say, most of the stuff I'm thinking right now, I'm not thinking consciously, and I'm just narrating it as it comes out of the darkness of my preconscious. So that's a bit odd. So that distinction doesn't work terribly well at all, I think. But the other one, I think, is the more kind of Catholic, the more open-ended, broad definition of thinking being any cognitive process. Anything that involves neuronal activity, I suppose. That would be equally problematic. Does that mean my eyeballs are thinking? There are neurons in my eyeballs. Does that mean my eyes are thinking? Does that mean that anything that's got a neuron is thinking? Can we truly say that an ant, because it has a brain, is thinking? I think I would have a problem with that. So that whole thing about thinking is really problematic, at least I find it so. And this thing about feeling, that distinction, I mean, if anything, if I was going to try and reach for a definition, or at least think about working towards one, I would probably I would absolutely include feeling as part of that, if only to distinguish it from complex computation. Because computers undoubtedly perform incredibly complex computational activities, and they will do more so. But I don't think it works to say what they're doing is thinking. It doesn't for me, at least. And I think what's absent from that, to distinguish it, at least the way I'm using the term, is because it doesn't have a felt component. It doesn't have that thing that's going alongside the thinking, which is giving it a weighting of some kind, operating on a different kind of dimension almost, or if you're kind of graphing it, they'll be thinking and feeling this way, and ours is constantly like this, whereas computers just do the thinking thing. That's fine. I know it's not a great analysis, but that's kind of how I'm thinking of that. And just in terms of thinking and action, here I suppose I'm reminded of Modern Mystic, your video, Dogs 2 I think it was called, which I looked at a couple of hours ago, which was to do with this thinking and feeling, a bifurcation you described it, in which, you know, thinking goes off in one area and feeling goes off in the other, and you acknowledge there's a large grey area, and I would locate thinking absolutely within that grey area, you know, as opposed to computation. You know, I would put computation and feeling off in, if I was going to bifurcate, and put thinking somewhere in the middle. But what you were talking about there, Nick, was this kind of time sequence in which you have the feeling leads to thinking, thinking leads to action. I think that was how it works, that kind of thing. I'm not sure I buy that even really. So it seems to me what's happening there is there's feeling, and then there's action, and then there's thinking. You know, and thinking is like for me, I see it as a kind of it's a kind of set of brackets that include both a little bit of the, you know, both the feeling, the stimulus that initiates the action, the beginnings of the action itself, and the kind of bodily states which comprise the feeling as well. You know what I mean? It's a kind of sensory motor model of cognition, which, as I say, includes both a little bit of the sensation, a little bit of the stimulus, a little bit of the response, and the body's reaction, the feelings, as you would say, in the midst. You know, and that whole thing for me is the thinking, because we're constantly in feedback with ourselves, aren't we? We're constantly in feedback loops with our own felt sense. You know, whenever we get a stimulus, that stimulus is always accompanied by our felt relationships to it and the beginnings of our reactions to it, which we might be able to halt. You know, we might be able to apply the free words or something and not actually act, or it might just be a kind of mirror neuronal simulation, in which case our own bodies will stop us acting. But nevertheless, we're involved in that moment of you know, as I say, we are involved. I mean, I is completely, you know, almost constructed in that moment, and constantly being reconstructed in each passing moment as the sensory world around us produces the bodily responses and the beginnings of a reaction to that responses, and that whole thing is kind of seamlessly welded into an ongoing I that marches through the whole process, it seems to me. So yeah, so while I think it's useful to talk about thinking, well, I would say, whilst I think it's useful to talk about kind of computation, calculation, logic and feeling as usefully analysable into separate components, I think when you're talking about them in terms of thinking, I think they're part of a gestalt, really, along with the action that comes out of that. That's what it seems to me. Beautiful day.